The Juneau World Affairs Council and Veterans for Peace Chapter 100, in collaboration with KTOO, present the 2025 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Unratified, the International Law of the Sea Treaties, and their potential for protecting Arctic resources and cultures. In this session, Where do we go from here? A panel discussion looking at next steps. Moderated by Juneau World Affairs Council board member, Jim Clark.
Well, thank you. I think it's been a terrific forum because of all of you, and you've done a terrific job. What I'd like to do is have you keep your answers short to these questions. And, you know, as a lawyer, most of my stuff begins with in the beginning, and then we go on from there and on and on and on. So, but I'd like to, I have a number of questions to ask, and so I'd like to make sure all of our panelists get a chance to answer, and I may bounce some things around. But in the interest of seniority, Professor Nossinger, where do we go from here? Should we start over, as was suggested, or do we go back? And if we go back, what do we go back to?
Okay, I would go back to 2012. That, in retrospect, is a kind of high point in the expectations for ratification of UNCLOS. It was at that point that there really were very well-informed possibilities for finally, after so many years, ratifying such an important treaty. I go back to that date, and I will be as short as I can, even though I am a lawyer and worse yet, a law teacher, because there was a very broad range of support. I mentioned yesterday that included virtually all of the top brass in our national military. It included the American Petroleum Institute. It included the U.S. Chamber of Commerce. It included the National Association of Manufacturers, and then many other NGOs in support of ratification. I think Lisa Murkowski, who has just steadfastly been in the forefront of support for UNCLOS, was already involved. And what happened then was that the opposition to the treaty organized politically within the U.S. Senate, largely under the leadership of Senator Jim Imhoff of the great maritime state of Oklahoma. And he managed to recruit just the right number of fellow senators, namely 33 others, making a total of 34, to oppose the treaty, because advice and consent requires a 2/3 vote in the Senate, and that was it. That was the end of it. And so that inspires me to think that even in these perilous political days we're experiencing, that I guess reflecting my own profession, we want to make sure that we're doing the best job of educating members of the Senate. Obviously, UNCLOS is not top priority for most senators, and probably most senators don't really understand it or know much about it or care much about it. But I would want to make sure that there was sufficient discreet lobbying, that there were sufficient easy-to-read materials that even senators would read, to at least represent a best effort to educate senators with the hope that sometime in the future, if not now, maybe in a few years, their vote would actually count towards ratification. So that would be my your aspiration that does rely on past experience where we actually seem to be coming close to ratification. It didn't work out given the strength of a coalition of senators in opposition in just the right number of 34. Thanks.
Dr. Baker, what are your thoughts on this? Go back to white paper and start all over, or go back to 2012, or how would you proceed?
I would start with 2025, quite literally, and to build on some of the discussion yesterday about the opposition to the convention and the need to think strategically, to draw on Waha's comments, about what we want to do, and don't just throw up our hands and say there's opposition, but come up with a strategy for addressing those concerns over the next few years while the current administration is in power, perhaps longer, and think also about what Dana Herndon said yesterday of, no, we don't anticipate that there will be ratification in this Congress, right? To think realistically about which Congress do we want to see the action, and start building the kinds of coalitions that Professor Knapziger just talked about. But I want to read just a couple of things, and this is directly from Project 2025. And if you read the section there on the State Department, there's a very clear vision set out in what they wanted to accomplish and what they are in fact now accomplishing. But specific to treaties, the President should recalibrate how the State Department handles treaties and agreements, primarily by restoring constitutionality to these processes. So right there, we could begin to address what we view as the constitutional reasons to move ahead with the Law of the Sea Convention and the BBNJ. Should direct the Secretary of State to freeze any ongoing treaty or international agreement negotiations and assess whether those efforts align with the President's foreign policy direction. And I don't know enough about the internal workings of the State Department. I haven't followed the reporting closely enough to know whether that freeze has been issued. But even if it's not yet been, to anticipate again arguments for unfreezing those negotiations. This doesn't mean everything that they're setting out here means shutting down all the conventions, but it does show us that there is an organized effort to think through what the treaties are doing for or against the country. The administration should also direct the Secretary of State to order an immediate stand down on enforcement of any treaties that have not been ratified by the Senate. And in practice, I've not heard of any such order. I would imagine that we would have heard from the Coast Guard on fisheries enforcement, or the Navy on any other enforcement issues. So these are things that raise grave concerns for me, if in fact we do want to, or we will be seeing the stoppage of even considering the work of all of the diplomats and scientists and lawyers and indigenous representatives that have gone into negotiating these treaties, especially the BBNJ. So we need to think strategically about responses to concerns, and I think that we have some discussions behind us this last day and a half that reflect very good reasons to support ratification of both of the agreements. And I think the piece that I would emphasize is the link that Waha pointed out to us in the last presentation we heard of, there are many laws of the sea, right? That each, the indigenous law of the sea, the Law of the Sea Convention we've been studying, and within the umbrella of the UNCLOS, there are many separate platforms for coordination and cooperation. And I think we can make a strong argument that coordination and cooperation between nations, between Western science and indigenous science, are to the benefit of our country. I think of Mr. Grove's comment yesterday that, well, we're looking at what benefits the United States and what doesn't. And I think we can make very strong arguments that there are benefits to the cooperation and coordination of activities, of environmental concerns, of climate concerns, of national security concerns, especially in the Arctic and in Alaska. And if we speak from Alaska with a unified voice, that there is an opportunity to move these conventions ahead, not in this Congress, but in maybe the Congress after or the one after that.
So your feeling is that for right now, we should engage in strategic thinking and look forward past that. And Ms. Blake, you spoke to the 10,000-year history of indigenous people in Alaska, and what would be your thoughts on retreating or right now to form a strategy going forward, and if so, what would it be?
Yeah, I think, as I said before, there's, in these international forums, there's quite a bit of room for indigenous people to weigh into the process, usually as it relates to giving consultation or just being a voice at the table, not really, as I've seen it, really intricately woven into what the current law stands and the way that things are developing. Indigenous communities usually have been and continue to be an afterthought to many, many different processes, and which is why, the indigenous law of the sea is just one basis for what can be, as there are many laws of the sea as it relates to many people globally. And what would it look like if we were to take something like the indigenous law of the sea and really take a hard look at that as international state leadership and say what of the indigenous law of the sea or the indigenous peoples and their protocols and how they have a relation with the ocean can be interwoven into maybe the 2025 version or a future version of the international law of the sea, or the BB&J. What does it look like if we're actually, instead of just taking consultative opinions from indigenous people, but really working intricately to ensure that they are at the decision-making table as sovereigns and giving the ability for them to vote and have a say in how that shapes and what that looks like moving forward.
Do you have any information on how they're doing it in Canada with respect to those very issues you just raised?
Yeah, Canada has a little bit of a different, I don't have a full holistic view, but I have a few examples, and definitely more interwoven into their federal processes than we have in the United States. Their level of consultation is beyond what we have outside of Executive Order 13175 for the U.S. I would, it is something that I've seen just in having conversations over there, to the level of input that indigenous people have in every single decision-making body. Think it's a better standard than what we have in the United States. But in having conversations with my Canadian brothers and sisters, they would say otherwise. But I think it is, a growth in a standard that can be pursued for the United States.
And that might be a strategy we consider over the period of time you're talking about.
Yeah.
Mayor Fuse, what are your thoughts on where we should go from here?
Well, I had a congressman once tell me, he said, we do two things really well down here. Said we completely ignore a problem and try to sweep it under the table until it gets so bad we've got to deal with it, then we overreact. So I think, we can talk about all the positive benefits. I think what might break this open is what happens if we don't do it. And this is the seabed authority issues. And China's predominance there within the filter of their control over rare earth metals and their recent militarization of it by restricting them to people. They're using that as their foreign policy, and with Trump having China be one of the centerpieces of his foreign policy. If we don't do this, that this NORA, the country that they've gone with it, that's a member with the metals to say going open, starts a clock ticking. There's a 2-year. If you come in and say, I'm going to go ahead and do it, if they don't have the rules in place, it automatically goes forward, completely unregulated. A lot of people don't know this. So to me, the most unconvincing arguments by the guy that we had from the Heritage Foundation was this just ignoring the tragedy of the commons and what's going to happen. You got a free-for-all out there, and Jim, you know, for mining companies and everything else, you need to know that there's some legitimate regulation when you get a lease for a property that you can actually do it. You can take it to your financiers. So to have this as a free-for-all in the middle of the ocean, that's a disaster. And if we want to say might is right and we're going to go out there, who's going to have the might? It's going to be China. They are so far ahead of us, it isn't even close. So I think maybe this issue might help drive it onto the table where there might be other people that care about all the things that Betsy talked about could weigh in, but it might take some kind of a crisis like this to get the ball moving. Over.
Well, since you have raised that and BB&J and enforcement issues during your questions, how do you see, what mode of enforcement would you see with respect to BB&J? And I'm particularly interested in how would environmental lawsuits be decided? There is a requirement for what amounts to an environmental impact statement, but I didn't hear anything about how it might be adjudicated and what standards might be used to decide whether it was sufficient or not.
If it opens standings for environmental lawsuits, that's going to be a real problem. You know, it's and people are becoming aware of this as we get further and further out. Some of the recent court decisions here, Chevron and 7 counties, which said, you know, you've got to deal just with those specific issues. We're starting to dial this back a little bit. I think it's going to have a problem convincing people that we went into a situation that would give standing for lawsuits. In terms of enforcement, if we've got more goodwill on the table, maybe we just haven't seen effective enforcement of some of our other provisions in terms of ghost ships, spoofing, turning off your AIS systems. So, you know, there's going to have to be some recognition of the world that we need to take care of things. We can't do this. But once there's that much money involved in it, people are going to try it. Like I asked the question, marine protected area, who's going to go out and arrest them for fishing in a marine protected area? 200, 300, 400 miles offshore. I don't think the Coast Guard's going to do that. I don't think they have the capability, but those enforcement issues are rife throughout everything, the Arctic Council, the IMO, everybody. So it's an issue.
Well, let's turn to an expert on the Coast Guard. Mr. Steve White, what are your thoughts on A, going forward, the strategy for going forward, and B, these enforcement issues we're talking about?
Well, first of all, I like going forward, seeing what we can do. Forums like this and identifying where there are, I call them gaps when I was talking before, but where there are concerns, kind of like Betsy was saying, hey, what do we see, what needs to be addressed, and is ratification the only way forward? I don't think it is. I think there's other options. While we're waiting, I'm not saying we don't or we do, but there's already several bilaterals. There's a lot of laws being enforced right now today. We continue to enforce things, even on the high seas. But figuring out that strategy for these are our concerns with why we want it ratified or the things we have. What tools do we currently have in place? What procedures do we have? These bilats, coalitions of working with other people, other nations. That's where a lot of those laws that are 200 miles out come from. They come from treaties and organizations, bilaterals where we can go out and enforce, and some of it requires cooperation. Hey, I see a boat from your nation here. I'm requesting a statement of no objection to go on there and check things. That kind of cooperation. So we can move forward. to address the concerns. And again, I really advocate for also doing that, not just in a governmental approach of working with other nations and our government executing stuff, but continuing to do what we can to address these gaps through the whole of the willing, nonprofit organizations, NGOs, working with government, working with the state, working with the nation, kind of working together, and that's really the way ahead.
Let me ask you too, as an expert on the technology and evolving technology in this area, what could we do, what do you foresee as technology coming online that may help us with enforcement?
Yeah, that's great. I sat on the North Pacific Fisheries Management Council, and I was there for enforcement and safety advice when I sat there as Coast Guard. And Simeon from St. Paul was the mayor of St. Paul. He came up to testify at the table and he showed a picture of a bunch of fur seals around St. Lawrence or St. Paul Island. And there's a NOAA law that says don't come within 3 miles of this rookery. And here's a French cruise ship with a whole bunch of boats, and they're all sitting in that rookery with seals all around it. You know, talking half a mile of the ship, and the boat's right up next to the shore. So you have a law, but it wasn't keeping whatever damage happens when those boats come there. We don't have a NMFIS enforcement person or a Coast Guard person sitting there looking at that, you know, going, hey, stay out of here. But now we can see that French cruise ship through AIS. And now we can communicate with them through different ways. Everything from satellite, telephone, you know, giving them an email to their ship, talking to them on VHF radios as we expand that capability, and we can even transmit information over AIS now. We can send them a message. So instead of saying, hey, we see you're there and we're going to send you a ticket, we can say, hey, we see you're 4 miles out and approaching this rookery. Did you know that you're not supposed to be within 3 miles here? And then we prevent whatever damage happens. So that's the kind of technology that we can use, and that goes into not just having laws, but having a way of making sure they're followed. And that includes best practices, because there's a lot of areas that are just, please stay out of this. It's an area to be avoided. It's not a law. And if you tell people, they usually are like, oh, thank you, I'll stay out of there.
Ms. Blake, a question for you. Yesterday, we were told that a reason for not ratifying UNCLOS was the revenue sharing provision, particularly the business of having to provide, and I guess this also went with the rules regarding mining on the ocean floor, but the fact that there would be revenue sharing, and that after year 6 they would start with a 1% tax and go on from there. How could we correlate that with Alaska's experience under ANGSA with 7J and 7I, where there's been very successful revenue sharing?
I think, you know, having a knowledge of 7I to the extent that it is something that is touted as, you know, look at this example of where 70% of everything that you, all of your natural resource extraction dollars are going and shared amongst all the other regional corporations, is something touted to be lifted up and shared. It has definitely kept a lot of our regional corporations from going bankrupt. What I will say, just in that vein, though, and a cautionary approach to this, if there is mining, it should be revenue sharing in my mind. But what has happened for 7I revenue sharing and 7J revenue sharing in particular is that as we see Alaska voted to end clear cutting of our forests and then take our dollars out of the 7J, the other regional corporations feel that is unfair, that we are no longer paying into 7J revenue sharing. And so what happens is it creates an interdependence on the dollars among all of us to continue to extract natural resources. So if we were to start and initiate down a path and, you know, there should be reparations in some manner, shape, or form if they're going to be mining in the deep sea, which I don't agree with holistically. Like, that just should never happen. But if it does, we should be really cautious, because it could create an interdependence of governments to rely on those dollars, therefore relying on deep sea mining to continue into the future.
Professor Nofziger, I just go back a little bit to the some of the reasons that were advanced yesterday for not proceeding with UNCLOS. One of the ones was the enforceability of legal actions against the United States, particularly concerns about climate change, that there would be enforceable lawsuits that could be filed against the United States for climate change. And as you know, there are other treaties that we haven't entered because of concern about being sued and that kind of thing. How would you respond to that criticism?
Well, I'd be glad to do that, but I'd first like to just pick up where Betsy left off on in raising the question of how the process works within the State Department. And that takes me back again, no surprise, to the period before 2012. I think all of our presidents, including President Reagan eventually, as of 1994, except for President Trump, all of our presidents have been supportive of ratification of UNCLOS. And I think the two presidents that deserve the most credit are President Clinton and his successor, President George W. Bush. Clinton, because of the 1994 agreement that brought Reagan aboard and seemed to call for U.S. ratification at that point. And President Bush, because he was convinced that ratification is a good thing for this country. And the point I really want to make that I referred to yesterday in my remarks is that it all depends on the individual president, but just as importantly, if not more importantly, on the advisors to the president. I cited particularly the two exemplary lawyers in succession of one after the other within the State Department, William Howard Taft IV, and then John Bellinger, just absolutely first-rate lawyers who advised the president on the merits of ratification. I think that had a big effect. And I think in the process of trying to continue as much as possible towards ratification, that we have to keep in mind, as I said before, education of particular personnel and the individuals involved. In response to the remarks yesterday about claims being brought against the United States, well, if they're valid as a matter of this country's commitment to environmental regulations, so be it. The claims should lie. We should be prepared to respond to them. But in any event, we should keep in mind that it's not just a matter of national interests, which were emphasized by Mr. Groves yesterday. That's important. We always have to take account of national interests, but it's a matter of international interests as well. We forget about the part of it. And I think we have a responsibility to support progressive laws involving climate change and otherwise, and be in a position to defend the actions we do take in those areas. So I'm not too sympathetic to the claim that was made yesterday that we should be very fearful of claims if those claims are valid. And let me just also say, while I'm at it, if I have another minute or so, that I think one of the advantages of the framework of UNCLOS is that it has three institutions built into the framework that are very important and would be of benefit to the United States. First of all, I contend the Seabed Authority itself, as it was reformed in 1994. Secondly, the Commission on the delimitation of the continental shelf that we discussed yesterday, the aspects of which Betsy brought forward. I think that she demonstrated last night in her remarks how important that could be to us. And then thirdly, something we really haven't talked about very much at all, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. Just a word about dispute settlement that's set forth in UNCLOS. There's an elaborate set of provisions in the annexes to the convention that fundamentally provide that any state becoming a party has the opportunity, which has most always been exercised, to indicate what form of dispute resolution they're prepared to participate in. And as you might expect, the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea, set up under UNCLOS with its headquarters in Hamburg, Germany, is one of the choices. Another is the International Court of Justice. And then the other two choices are arbitration that are set up under those annexes I mentioned. And if a state becoming a party to UNCLOS doesn't stipulate to one or another of those methods of dispute settlement, the default is arbitration. But that's a really, I think, important consideration that would resolve a lot of these fears about claims brought against the United States, to go back to your original question. And then I think that pretty well does it as far as those three institutions that are built within the UNCLOS structure. And then just finally, similarly, there now will be three, and only three, agreements that have been spun off by UNCLOS, the third of which was the focus of this morning's discussion, namely the BBNJ, when that comes into effect. And the prior two are precisely the 1994 agreement on Part 11 dealing with the seabed and reforming it in a way that was acceptable to Presidents Reagan and Bush, George W. Bush. And that seabed authority set up under the agreements is, of course, not perfect, but certainly was acceptable to all of the other states that had reservations about the original UNCLOS, except for the United States. We signed the treaty at that point, but we've never gotten around to ratification. And so that's one of the agreements. The other that I mentioned already is the BBNJ, and then finally the straddling Stocks and Highly Migratory Species Convention that I think does have some bearing on the BBNJ itself, but that's another discussion. In any event, I make those remarks because it's fairly easy to remember three important institutions that are set forth under UNCLOS and three important agreements that have been spun off by it. Thank you.
Dr. Baker, those are the considerations of the mandatory, some of the mandatory provisions for enforcement. Yesterday we heard the argument that it ought to be not made mandatory but made voluntary. What would you think of making the dispute resolutions provision voluntary instead of mandatory? And how would you weigh the pros and cons?
Well, I think it in some ways is voluntary in terms of the choices you have, as Professor Nafziger just pointed out, and I think was perhaps not fully explored when Mr. Groves was speaking. It was a little hard to do back and forth with him online, but there are those range of choices that Jim just laid out. You can either go to the Tribunal on the Law of the Sea, International Court of Justice, arbitration, many options. So I'm not sure there's a whole lot of advantage to making that provision about how you settle your disputes, which is already filled with options, by saying you don't have to settle disputes. And let me just read from, not the exact language of the BBNJ Treaty, which has its own separate set of provisions on dispute settlement. Both the BBNJ and the Law of the Sea Convention require first and foremost that you settle disputes by peaceful means. In the BBNJ requires that the parties cooperate to prevent disputes, and I'm not remembering off the top of my head whether that line is also in the Law of the Sea Convention, but then lists the specific means, a wide range of choices: negotiation, inquiry, mediation, conciliation, arbitration, judicial settlement, resort to regional agencies, or arrangement, or any other peaceful means of their own choice. And I think that wide range of options might be one reason for proponents of ratification as they work toward it in a few sessions from now, not this Congress, but maybe 2 or 3 out, would be to highlight that and say this gives us a choice. And if we're talking about regional agencies or regional arrangements as a possible forum for settling disputes, whether the Arctic Council could serve in that capacity is highly doubtful. They don't put themselves forth, but there might be something coming out of the Arctic states generally that they could have a regional, I mean, that would be yet another agreement to set up, or an institution to set up. But maybe we can envision a kind of regional body for the Arctic that talks about helping share information across all of the treaties that we've talked about. We've only been able to touch on the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement. The Arctic Council itself has generated, it's under the auspices of them, agreements on scientific cooperation, right? There are a lot of ways in which the Arctic states, and hopefully Russia will eventually be included in that circle, again, of active cooperation, that we could have it more of a regional dispute settlement setup.
Ms. Blake, let me just turn to her for a second, please. How would we fold in indigenous means of dispute settlement into the, I'm sorry, do you want to interject something first?
Yeah, I would, because it's apropos. Just to pick up on what Betsy said, buried in the verbiage that precedes this listing of the alternative methods of dispute resolution is something highly relevant, I think, to indigenous contributions that could be made, and that is a provision for conciliation, which, if we do draw a line between voluntary and mandatory, is certainly a very voluntary means. I don't think it's been very effective, but there it is, added to those stipulated numbered choices. And I think that's highly relevant from what I know of Indigenous culture to the interests and the contributions of Indigenous thinking to dispute resolution. You can correct me if I'm mistaken.
Yeah. Well, I myself am just Haida Tlingit and Atna, so I don't get to speak for all the Indigenous people as a result of dispute resolution, because even just in Alaska with our 21 different nations that exist here, dispute resolution happens differently, but you can find commonalities amongst a lot of the Indigenous peoples throughout the world. And just to give you some examples of what that looks like for peacemaking circles here in Southeast Alaska and being led a lot by the Kiiksquan, the Cake people, there is a lot of opportunity in those spaces for dispute resolution to be one that is more holistic and that doesn't just involve two individuals sitting in a room together and talking about how they're disputing what have you, but it is the opportunity to involve the greater community at large, or the people who are impacted the most, to be in that space so that each individual who is being impacted by whatever happens to be disputed about has the opportunity to have that conversation with each other and to work through a remediation that is agreed upon by everybody involved, not just, state leadership to state leadership, but a collective of voices, so that you have that holistic picture of what is actually taking place and a resolution process that matches that according to everybody sitting at the table.
Well, does the panel as a whole, and I'll go down the line and ask everybody, but does the panel as a whole see dispute resolution as negotiations and diplomacy, or litigation where, like the International Criminal Court, where judges make decisions, or a combination of both? Let me start with you, Mayor.
Well, if you've got in there where you can file lawsuits, this is absolutely a non-starter. Politically, that is never going to happen. So if you've got voluntary dispute resolution and you can work together, but you start putting those provisions in, we've just seen what's happened here of the just about deadlock, legal situation with this in the United States. And if you start with that politically, it's never going to fly.
Professor Knopfsinger?
Well, I've already had my day in court regarding dispute settlement.
But if you were to summarize it, what would you say?
I would say that it needs to be tailored to the particular understandings and agreements. For example, I've focused on provisions of UNCLOS, but if we're talking about international law of the sea more broadly, as the theme of this forum suggests, of course, negotiations is nearly everything in bilateral agreements. Bilateral agreements are extremely important, so we need to take account of differences in approach depending upon the understandings, if not formal agreements, at stake.
Ms. Blake?
Yeah, I would agree with what's been said already. I heard when I was working for Governor Walker, someone described, when you bring a resolution into litigation, you're using a hatchet where you need a scalpel. And I really love that analogy as it relates to, what actually needs to be resolved versus what a court is going to rule. And it's not as eloquent and not as full and holistic of an approach as I would see it.
Well, let me put this to you. If we have a series of requirements and you are to prepare an environmental impact assessment, which is what's called for, who gets to decide whether the impact statement that I prepare is sufficient? Is it all I have to do is just prepare one and give it, turn it in? Or if another group disagrees, how would they contest it?
Is that to me?
Yeah, we are.
Okay. Yeah, for me, that the conversation again goes back to the ability to have a bigger, bringing in voices that otherwise wouldn't be able to weigh into a conversation. it feels like I'm redundant because I'm an Indigenous person talking about Indigenous voices and constantly going back to that, but I think it's really important because it's often the voice that's missing.
And that's why I'm
Yeah.
calling on you.
Yeah.
I think that is a voice that's been missing.
And so, and if I were Empress for the day, and had the ability to say, yes, this is the body that's going to make that decision. For me, it's everything that I presented earlier. It is the ability to look at who is actually the gold standard of what a realistic way of living in a balanced relationship with our oceans looks like. Who are those folks? And those are the people in my mind who should be making that decision.
Steve?
Yeah, well, your answer on litigation and all that is probably way above my expertise, and you've got some legal experts here, but as somebody who's had to go out and enforce laws, and in a lot of foreign waters and high seas, and dealing with different flag states for whether it be fisheries or counter drug or immigration, and even, like I mentioned, disputed borders with Canada. I think some of what you're talking about in figuring out a dispute is what you do kind of beforehand. Figuring out what are the disputes, what are the things that we would have a dispute about, and seeing what we can work out in other means beforehand, so everybody's kind of operating from the same page and understands the playbook that we're playing by. And that comes from a lot of different things other than just laws, again, in my opinion. So,
Dr. Baker?
Yeah, I would echo Captain White that and again, the BBNJ requires you to work to prevent disputes. And that's very wide open as to how you do that. You can do it through scientific cooperation, and it's there, and I think it was Dr. Doro who mentioned it today. In the BBNJ, and I don't actually know, I'm not a BBNJ expert, and I don't know how they've set up who will evaluate the environmental impact statement assessments, for example, but I know that there is a scientific body, and as Daley mentioned, there are to be, Indigenous knowledge is also to be represented on that scientific body, so that anything that you're assessing about the biodiversity that's brought to that committee, there would be wider representation than just Western science. And that, to me, is a direction to head. It's certainly the successful model in the Central Arctic Ocean Fisheries Agreement, and still trying to figure out what does that look like in practice, who gets to sit on the committee. But sharing information, to me, is the biggest way to prevent disputes. And as over time, I won't go into any history, but as we look at how international treaties have been structured, more and more in the last 20 years, they've been all about sharing information, and rather than penalizing a state for not meeting its obligations, helping that state come along and gather the information that it needs. So I think if we take that approach to our international agreements, that there will be more chance of their acceptance by a wider range of parties.
You're talking about preventing disputes.
Correct.
You have the situation where disputes happen because of somebody on the high seas doing something. Great example is the Trent Affair during our Civil War, where the U.S. Navy took two Southerners off the ship, a British ship, and we almost went to war with Britain, and Britain almost recognized the Confederate States as a consequence of an action that had already taken place. And, so we need to be able to deal with disputes that have already occurred. Paul, any thoughts on that?
If I could just go back to enforcement one more time, just because it's come up over and over, if we're going to have any of these agreements, how are we going to make them happen? So I want to use the example of the donut hole in the Bering Sea, this part that we saw that, that goes beyond the 200-mile limits. Well, we had 14 nations of the world fishing out there, unregulated, classic tragedy of commons. So we had to use kind of a novel legal theory to say, well, maybe this is an inland ocean, although we are really stretching it. So we got with Russia, we published it and said, okay, nobody can fish out there. And so, but they ignored us. So what happened was we felt kind of helpless about it until the Russian Coast Guard went out and started firing shots across the bow of those ships, and they left, and it's been in place ever since. So that's one example of
dispute
enforcement. But I
resolution,
hope
yeah.
we don't have to come to that. But I mean, it's that's why I keep raising it. What's an effective way to actually implement these programs that actually work?
Well, there's one more question I want to ask before we run out of time, and I'll start with you, Dr. Baker. Will we, in your opinion, and if you'd cite ways in which you think this would occur, have more influence by being inside and a signatory and a ratifier of UNCLOS and the BBNJ than if we are out? And we heard the concerns expressed that the balance wasn't good enough for the United States, that there were more no's than yeses to be in. But would you kind of talk through how there would be more opportunities for us to be influential inside UNCLOS?
Sure. And so I'll start with the institutions that Jim mentioned. So right now, because we are not a party to the Law of the Sea Convention, we do not have a judge on the International Tribunal for the Law of the Sea. China has a judge, Russia has had a judge. I don't know the current makeup, it's rotating, but that's an important voice where we could have influence. The same is true on the Commission on the Limits of the Continental Shelf, which is the technical and science body that reviews the information states submit to show the extent of their continental shelf. We cannot have a commissioner on that as a non-party. And one of the, you look at who's sitting on the commission at any given time. There are Russian scientists, Chinese scientists, European scientists. That's a moving makeup, but we can't affect it at all. We did in our submission, if you will, in our information, which has not yet been formally submitted, but published on the U.S. government website. Before putting that out to the public, we consulted with, I believe, 14 or 16 former commissioners who have served in that capacity, so we could get the best input possible as to how to present our information in a way that conforms to what the commission expects to see. But without a seat on that commission, we are not assured of a strong say in how to approve the submissions that come before it. And the same is true, we've already heard multiple times about we don't have a seat on the International Seabed Authority. And we do, though, one of the things that was negotiated in the changes to Part 11 is that when, at such time the United States becomes a party, it shall have a permanent seat on the Seabed Authority. The United States is not named, though, and it could be that the country that has the greatest, I forget the exact wording, Jim, help me out, but basically the biggest producer of minerals to be mined, like the greatest potential for mining, shall be the country that has that seat, and that could switch. It could be China, or Canadian for that matter. Yeah.
Jim, you want to, Professor Nofziger, you want to add more influence in than out? I think I know your view, but it would be good to hear the pros and cons.
No, it's exactly as Betsy put it forward. I'm inclined to think that the opposition to ratification, though certainly by this point in time very well articulated, is just fundamentally ideological. It's fundamentally political. That the practical considerations of staying out just don't make sense. And it seems to me that the burden should be more on the opposition to show why we shouldn't be a member shouldn't be party to UNCLOS and get on with ratification. But as you already noted, you knew my views on that. And I just get frustrated that the opposition is so fundamentally ideological. It's well formulated by now. It's been really regurgitated for so long a period of time that there's a certain expectation we have about what the arguments will be. But I might just add that what we do, perhaps these days, following President Trump's executive order of April 24th, as I understand it, in largely trying to speed up the process leading eventually to both exploration licensing and what we don't have, exploitation licensing. It seems to me that keeping that in mind, just continuing to make the arguments in favor of ratification, though we've made them for so many years, has a great is of great significance, if for no other reason than to remind us that though speeding up the process may be in order, that ultimately we have in mind ratification. We also should keep in mind that what we do, perhaps in following up on the President's executive order, will have implications in terms of what others will do. Do we want others to simply engage in a laissez-faire practice of eventual exploitation once we have a model code and a regulations for exploitation of the minerals under Part 11 of the convention? Do we want others to just follow our lead in that respect? Speaking of chaos in just the Clarion-Clipperton area, let alone other deposits of minerals around the world, we ought to be concerned about that. It's not just a matter of what we want to do, but what we want others to do.
Jim, could I say one more thing?
Sure.
I so appreciated this and all of our discussions. My only regret is that I haven't seen more young people here. For almost all of us, we have more yesterdays than we have tomorrows, right? So
Well,
I want to
speak
say
for
that
yourself.
with Mariah,
I said, speak for yourself.
well, and I am speaking. I'm 76 now, okay? So Mariah and I have been
A
working
young
on a
man.
program for secondary school students of a sustainable development curriculum that will bring this. So I'd like to send it to you, and maybe we could make a presentation to World Affairs at some point to, get this type of discussion going in our schools. Our kids are not getting this right now.
That's right. Could we have a round of applause for our very energetic panel?
That was a panel discussion on Where Do We Go From Here? It was recorded October 11th, 2025 at KTOO on the unceded territories of the Occoquan on Tlingit-on-Ni as part of the 2025 Juneau World Affairs Forum, Unratified, the International Law of the Sea Treaties and Their Potential for Protecting Arctic Resources and Cultures. Produced by the Juneau World Affairs Council and Veterans for Peace Chapter 100 in collaboration with KTOO. With support from Core Alaska Kensington Mine, Wastman & Associates, Ramada Inn,